The house felt too big the moment the door closed behind him. Not loud, not dramatic, just empty in a way that pressed against my ears. My husband said he'd be late. Again. He didn't sound apologetic, just efficient, like the house and I were things that would wait exactly where he left us. I told myself I was used to it. I told myself a lot of things that night. Dinner sat untouched on the stove, cooling into something stiff and uninviting. I turned off the flame and leaned against the counter, staring at my reflection in the dark window. I barely recognized the woman looking back. Her shoulders were slumped, her eyes tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. I used to think loneliness meant being alone. I was wrong. Loneliness is being surrounded by people who no longer see you. My son was the only other presence in the house. I hadn't heard him come down the stairs, but suddenly he was there, quiet as always. He asked if I was okay. Just like that. No preamble. No small talk. The question caught me off guard because it was the exact one I had been avoiding all evening. I said yes, of course I did. Mothers always say yes. He didn't argue. He just nodded, the way he does when he knows the answer is a lie but doesn't want to embarrass me by pointing it out. That we ate together at the table, the two of us sitting across from each other in a space meant for three. The empty chair felt louder than anything we said. He told me about his day, about things that mattered to him in a way that felt careful, deliberate. I listened, truly listened, and realized with a sudden ache that I hadn't done that with my husband in a long time. Somewhere along the way, conversations with him had turned into schedules and reminders and logistics. With my son, the words still meant something. When he finished eating, he didn't rush away like he usually did. He stayed, his elbows on the table, watching me with an intensity that made me shift in my seat. It wasn't unsettling exactly. It was attentive. Like he was making sure I didn't disappear if he looked away. I laughed it off and asked why he was staring. He shrugged and said I seemed sad lately. I opened my mouth to deny it, then closed it again. The truth sat heavy in my chest, unspoken but undeniable, that I don't remember deciding to tell him anything. It just happened. A sentence slipped out about how his father had been busy. Another about how sometimes adults don't talk the way they should. I stopped myself before I went too far, but the line had already shifted. He listened without interrupting, his face serious, his posture still. When I finished, he said something simple, that I deserved to be happy. The words shouldn't have hit me the way they did, but they did. They landed somewhere tender and stayed there. That I reached across the table without thinking and squeezed his hand. It was meant to be reassuring, nothing more. Mothers comfort their children all the time. Still, the moment lingered longer than it should have. I felt his fingers tighten slightly around mine, like he was anchoring me. The contact grounded me and unsettled me all at once. I pulled my hand back and stood up too quickly, pretending to clear the dishes. Later, we sat in the living room, the television on but neither of us really watching. The glow painted the walls in shifting colors. He sat closer than usual, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him through the fabric of my sleeve. I told myself it was normal. The house was quiet. It was late. He leaned his head against my shoulder, and my first instinct was to let him. He was still my child. He still needed me. That was the story I clung to, but as the minutes passed, I became painfully aware of how much I needed him too. His presence filled the space my husband had left behind, and the relief of that scared me. I thought about moving away, about putting some distance between us, but the thought felt colder than the room itself. I stayed where I was, frozen between what was right and what was easy. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost careful. He said I didn't have to pretend with him. That line, more than anything else, lodged itself in my chest. I stared straight ahead, afraid that if I looked at him, something unspoken would become real. I realized then that the evening had shifted in a way I couldn't name yet. The house wasn't just quiet anymore. It was holding its breath that if I had known that this was the moment everything tilted, that the absence of my husband would create a presence far more complicated, I would have stood up. I would have said goodnight. I would have walked away. Instead, I stayed sitting there, telling myself I was just tired, just lonely, just human, never imagining how much those justifications were about to cost me. I told myself the next day would feel different. Morning light usually has a way of resetting things, washing away whatever feels heavy at night. But when I woke up, the weight was still there, sitting on my chest like it had been waiting for me. My husband had sent a short message sometime before dawn: busy, exhausted, see you soon. No question mark. No curiosity about how the house was doing without him. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, then put the phone face down as if that could silence the disappointment that my son was already awake. I could hear him moving around, calm and unhurried. When I joined him in the kitchen, he looked up and smiled in a way that felt too knowing for such an early hour. He asked if I'd slept well. I lied again. The lie came easier this time, and that realization unsettled me more than the lack of sleep itself. Something had shifted between us overnight. Nothing obvious. No single moment I could point to. But there was an awareness now, a shared understanding that we had crossed into different territory simply by acknowledging each other too closely. He lingered near me as I made coffee, handing me things before I asked, anticipating needs I hadn't voiced. It was efficient, almost domestic, and I hated how comforting it felt that we talked more that day than we usually did. Not about anything dramatic, just small things, music, memories, the way the house used to feel when his father laughed more. I caught myself filling in the silences, afraid of what might surface if I didn't. At one point, I heard myself complain about my husband's absence, the way it made me feel invisible. The words slipped out before I could stop them. As soon as I said them, I felt exposed, like I'd handed over something fragile without asking whether it was safe. He didn't judge me. That was the problem. He listened, fully and intently, as if my feelings were his responsibility to hold. He told me it wasn't fair that I was always waiting, always adjusting. He said my husband took me for granted. Hearing someone say out loud what I'd only whispered to myself felt like validation, and validation can be intoxicating when you've gone without it for too long. That I should have shut it down then. I should have reminded him that some things aren't meant to be shared between a parent and a child. Instead, I nodded. I let the conversation continue. I told myself I was teaching him empathy, showing him honesty. But underneath that justification was a quieter truth. It felt good to be understood. As the hours passed, I noticed how naturally I began to rely on him. When something annoyed me, I looked for his reaction. When I felt unsure, I waited for his reassurance. It was subtle, but it was there, weaving itself into my thoughts. I didn't realize how much space he had taken up until I reached for my phone to message my husband and stopped. I had already said what I needed to say. To my son, that realization made my stomach twist. I tried to course correct, pulling back, changing the subject, creating distance. He noticed immediately. His expression shifted, not angry, just alert. He asked if he'd said something wrong. The question carried more weight than it should have. I rushed to reassure him, to smooth things over, and in doing so, I stepped right back into the dynamic I was trying to escape. By evening, the house felt charged, like something unspoken was humming beneath the surface. We sat in the same room again, not touching this time, but closer emotionally than before. He talked about how he hated seeing me unhappy, how he felt like he had to be the strong one when his father wasn't around. The words were earnest, sincere, and deeply unsettling. He was stepping into a role that wasn't his to take, and I was letting him. That I felt a sharp sting of guilt, followed immediately by a wave of defensiveness. None of this was his fault, I told myself. And if it wasn't his fault, then maybe it wasn't mine either. Maybe this was just what happened when people were left alone together for too long, when emotional needs went unmet. The rationalizations stacked up quickly, each one making the next easier to accept. That night, my husband called. I let it ring longer than I should have. When I finally answered, my voice sounded distant even to my own ears. The conversation was brief, distracted. When I hung up, my son was watching me. He didn't ask what was said. He didn't need to. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, relief, maybe. Or satisfaction. I didn't want to name it. Lying in bed later, I replayed the day in fragments. The way I'd leaned on him. The way he'd stepped forward without hesitation. I knew, in a detached, sinking way, that something essential had been compromised. Emotional lines had blurred, roles had shifted, and pretending otherwise wouldn't undo it. Infidelity doesn't always announce itself with secrets and touches. Sometimes it begins quietly, with misplaced trust and the dangerous comfort of being needed. As sleep finally crept in, one thought kept circling back, refusing to let go. I hadn't just let my husband drift out of reach. I had replaced him emotionally, and the person who filled that space never should have been asked to. The guilt didn't arrive all at once. It crept in through ordinary moments, through pauses that felt too long and thoughts that no longer knew where they belonged. I caught myself watching my son when he wasn't looking, trying to recognize him again, trying to see where the line had shifted. He moved through the house with a quiet confidence now, less like a child waiting for permission and more like someone who believed he had a place beside me, not behind me. My husband texted to say he'd be home soon. Not that night, but soon enough for the word to carry weight. The message made my pulse spike instead of bringing relief. I read it over and over, searching for reassurance that wasn't there. Soon meant questions. Soon meant explanations I didn't know how to give. Soon meant the fragile balance I'd slipped into was about to be tested. That I started pulling away in small ways. Shorter answers. Less eye contact. I told myself I was restoring order, putting things back where they belonged. But distance, once noticed, has a way of provoking a response. My son noticed immediately. He asked if something was wrong. His tone was careful, but there was an edge underneath it, a tension that hadn't been there before. I said I was just tired. The excuse sounded thin even to me. He didn't accept it. He began inserting himself more deliberately into my day, offering help I hadn't asked for, hovering in doorways, checking in too often. Each gesture could have been harmless on its own. Together, they felt like pressure. I realized then that whatever I had opened between us wasn't something I could simply close without consequence. One afternoon, I snapped at him over something trivial. The sound of my own voice startled me. Sharp. Defensive. His expression changed instantly, the confidence draining out of it and leaving something colder behind. He asked why I was pushing him away when he was just trying to be there for me. The question hit harder than any accusation could have. I didn't have an answer that wouldn't expose the truth. That I tried to reassert myself, to remind him, gently, that I was his mother, that some boundaries mattered. The words felt rehearsed, borrowed from a version of myself that had already lost authority. He listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. When I finished, he said quietly that I was the one who had leaned on him first. That I couldn't expect him to pretend it meant nothing now. Fear slid into place beside the guilt. Not fear of him exactly, but fear of what I had allowed to grow. I had wanted comfort. I had wanted to feel seen. I hadn't considered what it would feel like to lose control of the narrative entirely. The power dynamic had shifted, and pretending otherwise only made it worse. The closer my husband's return became, the heavier the air in the house felt. I started imagining conversations that hadn't happened yet, confessions I didn't know how to frame. At night, sleep came in fragments. I'd wake with my heart racing, convinced I'd hear footsteps or voices that weren't there. Each morning, my son was already awake, already watching, as if he knew exactly what was unraveling inside me. The day my husband confirmed his arrival time, something snapped. I was standing in the kitchen, phone in my hand, when my son walked in and saw the message on my face before I could hide it. He didn't ask who it was. He didn't need to. He said, very calmly, that things were about to change. The way he said it made my skin prickle. That I told him none of this was his responsibility. That whatever happened between me and his father was for us to deal with. He smiled then, a small, unsettling expression that didn't reach his eyes. He said he was just trying to protect me. That if his father came back and hurt me again, it wouldn't be fair. The word fair echoed in my head, warped and meaningless. That was when I understood how badly I'd misjudged the situation. I had mistaken attention for innocence, loyalty for safety. I had given him emotional access without considering what he might do with it. He had built a version of events where he was essential, where his role was justified by my pain. And in doing so, he had crossed into territory I could no longer guide him out of. Later that evening, he made a decision without consulting me. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was efficient, deliberate. The kind of action that comes from someone who believes they're doing the right thing. When I realized what he had done, my stomach dropped so hard it felt like the floor disappeared beneath me. I confronted him, my voice shaking, demanding to know why that he looked at me with something like disappointment. He said I'd hesitated too long. That someone had to act. In that moment, the full weight of my choices crashed down on me. This wasn't just emotional confusion anymore. This was consequence. Something irreversible had been set in motion because I hadn't drawn the line when it mattered. As I stood there, staring at the person my son was becoming in front of me, one truth cut through the panic with brutal clarity. I had thought I was bending the rules out of loneliness. I hadn't realized I was teaching him that rules were optional if you believed your intentions were pure. And that realization, more than anything else, told me there was no simple way back from here. When my husband finally came home, the house didn't greet him the way it used to. There was no sense of return, no relief in the sound of the door closing behind him. Everything felt tight, compressed, as if the walls had shifted inward while he was gone. He looked tired, older somehow, and for a moment I saw the man I had once loved instead of the distance that had grown between us. That moment passed quickly. Too much had happened in his absence for nostalgia to survive. He asked how things had been. The question was casual, careless, and it almost broke me. I told him we were fine. The lie came out smoothly, practiced by now. My son was nearby, quiet, observant. He didn't look at his father with resentment or warmth, just with an unreadable calm that made my stomach twist. Whatever he had done, whatever lines he believed he had crossed for me, he carried it like a settled decision. Life tried to move forward, but nothing fit the same way anymore. My husband fell back into routines, assuming his place hadn't been altered. He didn't notice how conversations stopped when he entered the room, or how my son seemed to anticipate my moods before I spoke. Or maybe he noticed and chose not to name it. Silence can be a form of denial too. That I lived with a constant awareness of my own breathing, as if at any moment the truth might force its way out of my chest. I avoided being alone with either of them, afraid of what might slip if I stayed too long. Guilt became a low hum in the background of everything I did. Not the sharp, dramatic kind, but the exhausting kind that never lets you rest. My son kept his distance now, but it wasn't withdrawal. It was control. He spoke when he wanted to, offered help only when it suited him. Sometimes our eyes met across the room, and there was an understanding there that made me look away first. He didn't need reassurance anymore. He believed he had done what was necessary. That belief frightened me more than anger ever could have done. I tried to repair things with my husband, to reinsert myself into the role I had neglected. We talked more, carefully, like people stepping around cracks in the ground. But every attempt felt hollow, as if I were performing a version of myself that no longer existed. Emotional infidelity leaves residue. Even when nothing is said, it lingers, altering the way you touch, the way you listen, the way you choose your words. At night, I lay awake replaying everything, searching for the moment I could have stopped it. The answer was always the same. There were many. Small ones. Easy ones. I had ignored them all because they didn't feel dangerous at the time. I had mistaken loneliness for justification and honesty for harmlessness. I had believed that intention mattered more than impact. The house settled into a new rhythm, one built on unspoken agreements. My husband remained unaware of the full truth, or at least he never voiced it. My son carried himself with the quiet certainty of someone who believes he understands the world better than the adults around him. And I moved between them, carrying the weight of what I had allowed to happen, unsure where I belonged anymore. There was no dramatic confrontation. No confession that cleared the air. Life doesn't always offer those moments. Sometimes it just keeps going, dragging unresolved things along with it. I learned how to smile at the right times, how to answer questions without revealing too much, how to live inside a version of normal that felt increasingly artificial. What haunted me most wasn't fear of exposure. It was the knowledge that I had changed something fundamental. I had taught my son a lesson I never intended to teach, that emotional boundaries are flexible, that love can justify overreach, that being needed can feel more powerful than being right. I saw echoes of that lesson in the way he interacted with the world now, and I wondered how far it would follow him. Some nights, when the house was quiet again, I caught myself listening for the same stillness that had started it all. It no longer felt empty. It felt crowded with memories and choices that refused to fade. I understood then that betrayal doesn't always destroy relationships outright. Sometimes it reshapes them into something unrecognizable, something that functions but never truly heals. That I don't know what the future holds for us. I don't know if the truth will ever surface, or if it will stay buried under routine and denial. What I do know is this: absence created a space, and in that space, something grew that never should have. And no matter how carefully I move now, no matter how much I try to protect what's left, I carry the certainty that some lines, once crossed, don't disappear. They wait, quiet, patient, ready to remind you of the moment you chose comfort over consequence.